All right. Hello and welcome. I'm Jinhua Zhao, a professor of city and transportation planning at MIT. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum, which is designed by the MIT Mobility Initiative. Today, we'll continue our discussion on the electric vehicle development. Previously, we have Professor Dan Satterwhite talk about battery technology, Professor John Paul McDuffie talk about the business reality, and last week, we have Professor Jing Li talk about the charging station location and coordination. Today is really my great pleasure to have Professor Dan Sperling joining us to discuss the EV policy and regulation as seen from a regulator, academic, and a policy wonk. Not only the necessity and impact of public policy, but also the nuances and dilemmas in the EV policymaking processes. So before I formally introduce Professor Dan Sperling, I want to do a short warm-up exercise here. I prepared a small poll asking the audience interest in electric vehicle. It's a simple poll. The first one is you see EV as your primary research and a professional interest. The second one as a secondary research interest, or you're just curious. Hopefully that this gives you some context about the relevance of the audience here. So we have 120 people submitted the vote. I will give 5 more seconds. Okay, I will end the poll and share the result. Dan, can you see the result? 32% primary, 41 secondary, and 27 just curious. All right. So the second warm-up exercise, please type everybody in the chat. I encourage everybody to type your organization, your city, and the local time. So I'll put MIT, Cambridge, that's 12 now. So BGE from Austin, Yale, Buffalo, Wharton, UCL, oh, John Paul, I see you there. Thanks for joining us again. Thanks. Great. All right. Thanks for everybody for typing your organization there. That again gives hopefully Professor Sperling a context of who the audience are. So one last thing I want to say is as an expectation of this forum, because contrast most the webinars, the audience are just utterly silent. In this forum, we want to really change that. We expected everybody to contribute an idea, right? Either in the form of question to Professor Sperling or as a comment. Please type everything into the chat on this, right? We will compile all the chat of questions. It turns out to be a very valuable a compilation of ideas that we'll share with the speakers. Yeah. So now let me formally introduce Professor Dan Sperling. He's a distinguished Blue Planet Prize Professor of Civil Engineering and Environmental Science and Policy. He's a founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies and a founding chair of the Policy Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy at the University of California, Davis. Professor Sperling is the international authority on transportation technology assessment, energy and environmental aspect of transportation, and transportation policy. He authored over 250 papers and 13 books, including many, probably you guys know, the 2 Billion Cars book in 2009 and the 3 Revolution book in 2018. In 2015, he was elected the chair of Transportation Research Board from the National Academies. And directly related to today's forum, in 2007, Governor Schwarzenegger appointed him to the California Air Resource Board, holding the automotive engineering seat on the board, and is retained by Governor Jerry Brown. For many of you know, the California Air Resource Board embodies the California leadership in climate change action, is the most impactful and aggressive regulatory body. In this position, Professor Sperling oversees the policies and regulation on climate change, low carbon fuels and vehicle, and sustainable cities. Professor Sperling, it's my honor to have you here, and the forum is yours.
Thank you very much. I need Okay, I'm going to share. So, all right, so thanks very much. Thanks for that, Jing. Well, thanks for that great introduction. Let me just give you, there's so many things I'd like to say and talk to you about. So just so you know what these are the topics I'm going to address: the role of policy, how EVs fit into the transportation system, the global context of this, all the challenges along the way, and then what are the best policies to move forward. And I'm going to give some detail on what California has done as a policy model, because so much of what California does is imitated in the US as well as around the world. So I want to start out by just saying that, when we think about electric vehicles, I know we've heard several presentations here in this series already, and I use this kind of an academic jargon, but they are socially determined in the sense that EVs, with all of their attractions, are not inevitable, or at least they're not inevitable in a near-term time frame. And so if we're really interested in seeing more electric vehicles, there really has to be significant policy intervention for it to happen. And it's partly the challenge is it's very disruptive for businesses, different governments, and a lot of different groups in our society. And for the auto industry, it really is very disruptive. It's the biggest change since the Model T. Okay, so, but having said that, the most important, the biggest motivation for electric vehicles is climate mitigation, decarbonization, by far. And as I say here, that probably as we look at decarbonization, there's the two top strategies are, one is renewable electricity, and number two is electric vehicles. And for the transportation sector, there's nothing even close to electrification as a strategy for getting towards net zero. Okay, so having said that, the reason why the trajectory is happening at a fairly fast rate now is because the cost of batteries and the cost of the vehicles has come down so much. And in the next graph, I'll show you the cost of batteries, and I think you've heard it in previous, have come down 90% or so in the last 15 years. So this is an analysis. So we did this, the California legislature asked us at the University of California to do an analysis of how do you get to net zero in the transportation sector by 2045. And so we've done considerable. So my institute, we do a huge amount of research on electric vehicles. We have probably the most prominent electric vehicle research center in the world, university center in the world. So anyway, we did these kinds of calculations and forecasts, and we find that roughly by 2030 or so, the total cost of ownership, in other words, the full cost of owning and operating vehicles, including all of the costs of infrastructure, that cost should reach parity with the gasoline and diesel vehicles, and should be reduced significantly below those fossil fuel vehicles going into the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about this going forward. So, part of it is, as I mentioned, battery costs have come down so much. But what's interesting and relevant is that this year, for the first time in, I guess, forever, the costs have actually gone up. Certainly for the lithium-ion batteries, they've gone up. A lot of it was because of the lithium costs and shortages. It's not because the cost of making the batteries has gone up. It's because of market shortages. So it's a demand and supply. Price has gone up because overall the costs are continuing to go down. The cost of manufacturing the vehicles and the batteries. And I'll get back to that in a moment. So the question is, why do we need, if the costs look so favorable, why do we need government intervention? And the simple answer is because consumers don't make decisions based on a total cost of ownership. There are many vehicles, even today, that are cost competitive with gasoline and diesel vehicles. Certainly some of the delivery vehicles that have relatively short ranges, small batteries, they're competitive with diesel right now, and in some applications. And for light duty vehicles, if you drive the vehicle a long ways, a lot of mileage, then the cost savings from the energy and the lower maintenance will actually offset the higher purchase price. But on average, it's going to be a number of years yet. So, consumers, they're conservative, there's concerns over resale value. These are the same things we went through in the debates over the CAFE standards and fuel economy but this is just taking it to a whole nother level. And I should point out, this electrification phenomenon I'm talking about is for all vehicles. And we're talking about cars, light duty vehicles, medium and heavy duty trucks. That is the transition that's taking place. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. These slides are made available. So that's why I'm going a little fast, because you can all go back. And then if there's any questions you have, I'll be delighted to talk about it. Okay, so, this is just more of it. There's so many challenges, and, we sometimes make it sound straightforward and easy, or at least in California we do, maybe not in other parts of the country. But there is a lot of, there is this discussion that it's inevitable, it's happening, the costs are looking good. What's the problem? Let's just move faster and faster. But there are all these issues, and some of these points here about the loss aversion by consumers, the principal agent problem, network externalities. Each of these is a PhD dissertation in itself. So for all of you that are graduate students out here, this is a good slide for thinking about possible dissertations. And so, there's many ways to accelerate electric vehicle sales. One approach is used by Norway. They are at just about 90% market share now for battery EVs and plug-in hybrids. They're basically completely transformed in terms of vehicle sales. But they did it with huge incentives. If you add together the incentives, it's for a lot of these vehicles, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 per vehicle. And that's because they were exempted from the taxes on gasoline vehicles and other kinds of incentives that were given. Europe is using a different approach. The EU is using a different approach. They're using performance standards. So they've imposed carbon dioxide standards on vehicles, and they've been doing this, for about 15 years now. And they've just made them so aggressive that the only way the car companies can meet those standards, be in compliance, is to make an increasing number of electric vehicles. And in fact, in Europe now, the market share is something like 20%. In some countries like Germany, it's up close to 25% now, market share for electric vehicles. The other approach is what California is using, and that is a requirement imposed on the car companies that they must sell a certain percentage of their vehicles as zero-emission vehicles. And I'll give you some more information on that in a moment. But these are the primary strategies for achieving this acceleration. But in fact, there's so many other things that need to be done to make it happen. You've heard it in some of the previous slides, but it goes way beyond that. And I'll give additional examples. Even when you talk about charging infrastructure, It's like, in California, I just saw an analysis that we have a law that requires local governments to expedite, to streamline the permitting of charging stations, because this is the purview of local governments in the US. Well, almost none of them did it for several years, and it's just started accelerating now. But even a large share of the local governments are not doing anything to help the permitting and placement of chargers. Okay, so we do have, when we talk about different policies, economists like to say, use market instruments, use carbon taxes, adjust the prices in different ways. And that's not how we're doing it with electric vehicles. But we have a unique situation with electric vehicles now. And that is that it is now widely accepted that this is the technology of the future. And it's really just a question of how fast and how to get there. And so that changes the policy context tremendously in how it could be or should be approached. So it's now to the point where, all of the industry leaders, all of the experts are in agreement. And the agreement is that light duty vehicles are going to be mostly battery EVs. There'll be some plug-in hybrids. There might be some hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in the light duty sector. In the heavy duty sector, it's going to be mostly battery EVs, except possibly for the long distance, long haul trucks. And there's a question about the role of biofuels or hydrogen. But for the rest of the, what we call the different class 2Bs, 3s, 4, 5, 6, most of those are going to be battery EVs, almost certainly. But the question is, how do you do it? How fast? There's all kinds of issues on getting this done. And I would note, going back to policy context, California is saying that biofuels are not acceptable for either light or heavy duty. It has to be electric drive. So it has to be either battery EV, plug-in hybrid, or hydrogen. And it cannot be combustion, even though, of course, a plug-in hybrid has some combustion. But it cannot be combustion engine as the primary motive. And so given the role of California, that means that biofuels are actually likely to play a small role in the US. And it could be a bigger role in other regions of the world. But as a function of policy, we're not going to see much of it in the US. And so this is just illustration. All the car companies are all saying, now they all say that, I would point out, so those of you interested in the nuance of policy, all these announcements are targeted at their investors. They tell a very different story to the policymakers. To the policymakers, they say how hard everything is. To their investors, they say we're all in. And the reason for that is the Tesla story. So this is just from a couple of weeks ago, what the market capitalization was of all of the car companies. And if you look at this, Tesla is worth more than just about all the other companies put together. None of them even close. Toyota is the closest, and it's, a third of what Tesla is. And so all these companies are trying to figure out, okay, how do we get to be seen as a Tesla, as a company of the future, as opposed to a company of the past? And I think there's a lot of evidence starting to emerge that this branding for these car companies in moving from being a combustion engine company to a electric drive company is really hard. And you see, I say that partly because in Europe, like in Norway, we're seeing companies like BYD and NIO have a more brand acceptance than Mercedes. A recent study was just done that showed that. And most of us are shocked, to hear that. But so I think that's a lot of these companies, in some ways, Tesla's valuation is worth it because there is real question about these, I'll call them legacy companies, moving into this electric future. And, so Tesla really, nowadays, many of us have a love-hate relationship with Tesla. And, Elon Musk doesn't help things at all. But what Tesla has done is extraordinary. They've been innovative in so many ways, in terms of vertical integration, in terms of integrated design of the vehicles in the factories, the software leadership, where they, when there was all the problems with the chips, car companies couldn't get the chips they needed, but Tesla took any chips they could get and then would reprogram them. And most of the car companies couldn't do that. They pioneered over-the-air software updates. If there's a recall of a Tesla vehicle, they just beam out some software changes over the air, and they don't, so greatly reduces their cost. So anyway, they built their own charger network. They're doing automation, and of course that's controversial as well, but it's really, they have been a leader in that. They've gotten rid of their dealers. They've done so many things that have led to these huge profit margins. I've seen estimates that they're making 30% profit on their like Model 3 and Model Y vehicles. Okay, and so part of the rest of the story is that that the US is lagging way behind the rest of the world and increasingly slow. And you see here, the Chinese market, they're up to about 25% market share, and they have like 28 million vehicles a year they sell. US is, around 15, 16 million. So their electric vehicles, if you just counted the electric vehicles they produced, they'd be, I believe it is the second largest market in the world, just in terms of their electric vehicles. And even Tesla's struggling in China. They're lowering their they're not increasing production. They're cutting back production. They're cutting back their prices. So one of the big questions going forward is, are these Chinese electric vehicle companies, because they are poised to play a dominant role in the world. Okay, and why is the US lagging? Part of it is this is just consumer preferences, and this was a survey done, global survey, and American consumers were the least likely to embrace electric vehicles of any of these countries in the world. And so, okay, this is, we've had discussions about minerals, so I'm going to skip over this one, but it's a geopolitical question, and it comes back, in terms of how we handle electric vehicles and policy. If we start having more protectionism, it's going to increase the cost of the vehicles. And so there's that implication. And so there's many, again, you've heard some of this, there's so much innovation happening in the battery chemistries, the batteries, the vehicles, the skateboard designs of the vehicles. And so, yeah, let me skip over this. And all the innovations with the vehicle, the skateboard designs. And, one of the challenges I want to raise here from both a policy and societal perspective is, the companies are all starting to integrate the batteries into the chassis. And it saves money, it saves weight, and it saves cost, and they can get greater density. But the downside is it's going to be very difficult to repair these, and it's going to be very difficult to recycle. Miguel, we're here, I think it's you with your, and so we have, the repair is going to be difficult, recycling is going to be difficult, repurposing is going to be difficult. And so we don't have any policy for this in the US, and Europe does have end-of-life policies. We don't in the US, but this is probably something that's that should be, will be happening going forward. And even California doesn't have anything. So as I said, as I implied, we are in a unique situation with this particular technology and product. And I think the evidence is becoming very strong, very powerful, that by far the best policy for accelerating EVs is not incentives, is not even getting, lots of chargers out there, but all of that's important. But the most important one are these mandates or very aggressive performance standards targeted at the car companies. Because the car companies, they have the technology, they know how to do it. They're actually doing it in a major way in China and Europe. They're just not doing it in a major way in the US. And so if we really want to accelerate this, this is the primary strategy. And in a moment, I think you know what I'm implying with this about what the US is doing. So California has been on this path for a long time. We actually started, we had our first zero emission vehicle mandate 1990. And, we have all kinds of policies that support this transition to electric vehicles and decarbonizing transportation. So here's a policy. So this is Zeb Mandate that I've been saying is such a great idea. Well, it is now in 2022. It was not in 1990 when we adopted it. So this is one of the, I don't know if we'll call it a mistake or, but it was the wrong policy at the time. And we thought California thought in 1990 that the technology was starting to come in, consumers would embrace it. They were wrong. And so the Zeb Mandate has this long history where we've kept trying to adjust it to keep it alive. But it's really now, as I point here, in 2012, for the first time, we strengthened it. And then and just to give you a sense of, no one can foresee the future very accurately. So at that time, so I was on the board then, we adopted a rule that said between 10 and 15% of vehicle sales must be zero emission by 2025. And the 10 to 15 was because of the complication of the policy. It didn't really have a number, but that was the implication. But in fact, what's happened is here in 2022, we're just about at 20% already. So we've blown past that. And we thought in 2012, this was being really audacious. And the car companies told us it was a mistake. And yet here we are blowing well past it. All right. And one other point I want to make here about these policies. So I did say all the good things about Tesla. Elon Musk has criticized the California Air Resources Board, telling them, they go too slow, they're, too wimpy, I guess but the reality is Tesla exists today only because of the Zeb Mandate. It exists for some other reasons, but if it was not for the Zeb Mandate, they would have gone bankrupt and out of business. And they were making some of their early cars around 2012, the Model S, they were making over $20,000 per vehicle from credits they were selling to other car companies, because these credits are tradable. So, all right, I know I've got so much to say and I know we're moving on. Let me just, so this is the California rule. It requires 100% of all sales to be ZEVs by 2035, 1/3 by 2026, which is in just its model year. So in just 3 years, 2/3 in 2030. It's really aggressive. And so let me talk just briefly, I talk about some of the issues. When we designed this policy, there's so many embedded assumptions and so many embedded details that are so crucial. And you just see it here. It's like when we design it, we have to design it so that it can be acceptable in other states, because if California, we know California is not an island. And so the whole goal is for California to be a model and for what it does to be replicated. And so the rule that exists in the Clean Air Act, the law says that other states can only adopt an emission standard that is the EPA standard or California. They can't do anything else. They have to take one or the two. And, you know, one might say that's kind of a flaw in policy, or at least it's a suboptimal way of doing things. There's timing. Are you going to make the credits tradable? Are you going to, how do you deal with the risk to the car companies versus the demands by civil society, by NGOs and environmental justice groups? Okay, I want to get through this so we get to questions. So this is just the lots of issues. You know, we have durability requirements built into the Zeb mandate to protect consumers. So I also want to say it's just not cars, as I said, it's trucks. So 2 years ago, California adopted essentially a Zeb mandate for trucks, for all trucks. And what it shows here is that for most trucks, 75% of sales have to be ZEVs by 2035, 40% of the long haul heavy duty Class 8 trucks. But you know what? We're about to, that wasn't enough. So you know, we've decided in California, if we're going to get to net zero by 2045, we've got to accelerate this. So in a couple months, we're going to amend this rule, this law, so that we require 100% of all trucks must be zero emission by 2040. And there's even a push to make that by 2036. So at the latest, we're going to say 2040, all truck sales must be ZEVs. That is, I mean, that is revolutionary, I guess, is what I would say. And this is just describing that. Okay, incentives. I'm just going to say one thing about incentives, about the federal incentives. You know, they talk about the incentives that have been adopted by the Biden administration. It's transformational and so on. I don't think so. You know, by itself, it will have relatively little effect. Combined with a Zeb mandate and other policies, yes. But there's incentives by themselves, even with the money for the infrastructure that came out of the bipartisan, the IIJA, small. And so my point here is the only, or the most important policy is one imposed on the car companies to accelerate it. So EPA could come up with very aggressive greenhouse gas standards for vehicles, you know, essentially the CAFE standards, but it would have to be very aggressive to really move the needle. And so that's just what I was saying about federal incentives. Another point I want to make is, you know, we talk about the first 10 or 20% of sales being difficult, but in many ways, it's the last 30% that are going to be the most difficult. And that's because you get to the point where people are now on their second car. Now you're people living in apartment buildings and condos that don't have easy ways of charging. And you just have ideological opposition. You know, you think of the vaccinations. We haven't been able to get 100% of people vaccinated. Why do we think we're going to get 100% of people to buy electric vehicles? So, okay, and then there's the public charging. Public charging is a huge challenge that's not appreciated. I mean, really, especially with trucks, you need, you know, a mini power plant at truck stops to serve the trucks that are going to be using electric vehicles, charging infrastructure. So this is my closing slide. And this is, I mean, I've kind of given you lots of hints what the answer to this is, but this is a real issue that the US is lagging, and even what the Biden administration is doing will have some effect, but, you know, I don't think it'll be that significant by itself in terms of just throwing money at it is not enough. And I think the kinds of things that California is doing, what Europe is doing, and what China is doing have been shown to be far more important and far more effective in accelerating the transition. So thank you very much, and I'll be delighted to have a conversation.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. So I'll start with a few questions to trigger the dialogue. I also I will invite Professor John Paul to give some remark after mine, and then John Movenzati will curate the audience questions, right? So Dan, we'll start with the consumer behavior side, right? You mentioned the point that consumers don't look at the total cost of the ownership. It's very myopic. Particularly, you mentioned that incentive is necessary, but not necessarily paid by the taxpayers, right? There are other instruments to nudge the behavior here, right? So can you give us some example on the detail here?
Well, my favorite policy is what's called Feebates, and that's the idea of you charge a fee to certain vehicles, in this case to basically to all combustion engine vehicles, and a rebate to zero emission vehicles. And you can make that revenue neutral, and it is using, a basic policy instrument of the economists as you're changing market signals. And you can do it you can do it in terms of sales tax. One thing we're starting to look at in California with trucks is adjusting the registration fees so that you pay a high registration fee if you have a diesel truck, a low or zero electric. And a number of European countries have already done this.
Thanks. Yeah. So next, move to a little bit on the business side. You're saying that for the OEMs, they are telling one story to the investors while telling another story to the policymakers, right? At the same time, also we're saying that there is gradually we're achieving a consensus among leaders here, right? So tell us a little more about where the two sides, the investor side and the policymaker, can really converge and reconcile any differences, so that do not have to tell two stories and really concentrate and pursue this.
Yeah, I probably overstated that. So what I said like 2 or 3 years ago was absolutely correct. But actually today, when we passed the new Zeb mandate for 100% of sales by 2035 in California, not a single car company opposed it. They opposed certain details, the durability requirements. Tesla didn't like having to put an adapter in the trunk, with the car sales. They quibbled over details, but not a single one actually opposed it. And the same thing with trucks. What's happening with the trucks is that they say, okay, California, you can be the test, the test lab, the test tube for trying it out, but they actually are opposing it opposing other states joining it. So I think it's just going to be it's a gradual evolution that the companies know they have to do it, and a lot of them are just saying, okay, I'm going to do it. But one of the things is the so-called compliance, Section 177 states, which includes Massachusetts, which is adopting it. There's about 15 states adopting this Zeb mandate. The car companies are going to send all their cars to those states. So the other 35 states, mostly the red states, are not going to be getting many cars because they won't have this Zeb mandate, and the car companies won't be concerned about compliance.
Yeah. So next, let's move to if now we agree upon the goal, but there's contrasting approaches, right? You mentioned in Norway, they're using incentive, huge amount of incentive. European using aggressive standard, and California directly mandate on the supply side, right? So here, between this regulating the supply versus subsidizing the demand, clearly there are different country or different parts choosing a different pathway here. Even as you illustrated, the federal government, the RJA and RRA, clearly are choosing the incentive side rather than the supply mandate side, right? Tell us a little more about why this different body choosing different one and all the consequences of that.
A lot of it emerges from kind of the policy tools that are readily available to a government. So in Norway, it's a small country, and they had these huge taxes on gasoline cars. So it was relatively easy for them to adjust. And of course, they're a rich country and rich consumers. So that was relatively easy choice for them. The EU, they had started with these CO2 standards a while ago, and back in about 15 years ago. So I think it was just a natural progression for them. The US did have, does have also CO2 standard, greenhouse gas standards on vehicles and CAFE standards, but the politically has been, EPA has found it difficult to increase it. There's been a lot of opposition. EPA gets beat up every Republican administration. They get beat up, and they've been beat up so much it's hard for them. They've lost capacity, and they need the political support to be really aggressive. So I think as a result, the one thing the Biden administration was could do easily was throw money at. It's kind of like what Norway did, right? But at a different scale.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So next one to you've been working in this policymaking field for many years. I'd like you to maybe give us example where the policy overstepped, right? Versus the other side, the policy may be lacking. Right. Give me a concrete example of this. The two sides, the policymaker really have to juggle between the two, and there's a lot of nuance and a dilemma in this.
Yeah, there's numerous examples. I gave the Zeb Mandate in 1990 when California adopted it. That was way too aggressive, way too soon. But I'm going to counter that story about calling it a mistake. Because this is what I've learned in the policy world, is that if you want major changes, transformations of the type we're talking about, you've got to put a stake in the ground. You've got to do something really aggressive that really gets everyone's attention. And whether it's 100% trucks, 100% cars, if we're doing it, we could do something like that with hydrogen if we wanted. And in the end, we might have to make adjustments. And ideally, you have a policy context that, policy process where adjustments can be made along the way if you do get too aggressive. But I think, there's so many, for a transformation, you need so many entities to play a role. You've got the electric utilities, you got the charging companies, you've got the local governments, you got the car companies, and to get all of them on the same page. So we don't have them all on the same page. Even in California, the electric utilities are really lagging in getting the charging infrastructure out there and getting the make ready, behind the meter infrastructure in place. And that's going to be a real problem soon. And so, but, you just got to, everyone's not on the same page, and the best you can do is, put that stake in the ground and say, this is what we, the country, we, the state, are committed to, and then all the others will hopefully coalesce around it. You see, consumers in the U.S. have, relatively less interest in electric vehicles than anywhere else, and I think it's because they've not been hearing from our leaders that this is the path forward.
Yeah, that's very interesting. If you have a clear leadership making a stake, this actually de-risk all the other participating parties in this.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the last question from me is another policy dilemma. From US, from one side, we're pushing for this made in America, try to encourage local economy, local manufacturing. From the other side, if you really want to accelerate sustainability, there's a lot of international competitors out there, right? So to what degree we open the market, let other people play, like what you give example, BYD in Norway, for example, right? Versus protecting our local domestic industry and manufacturing.
Yeah, that's the, that's the $1 billion, that's the $1 trillion question.
Right.
I mean, if we think we're going to depend on minerals in the US, for our batteries, it's not going to happen, and it's going to be disruptive. And, so we did an analysis at UC, some of my researchers, that we looked at Europe and the US, just Europe and US, and we said, okay, the amount of investment that's needed in batteries and vehicles and the trajectory, and it's uneven, but in different kinds of ways. And if there's not a trade back and forth, if there's trade back and forth, that will greatly ease that transition and lead to a much more efficient path forward. So that's the tension here. You got sustainability issues, you got issues with indigenous communities, water, and so on, with the minerals and the mines. You've got NIMBYism at work. On the other hand, we've got there's the massive benefits from these technologies. And I think this is a case where there's not an obvious answer. It's going to be a lot of adjustments going forward, and
Right.
there's no right way to do it, I guess, is the answer.
Right.
I'll say one thing. My years in the policy world, so I'm mostly a researcher. I mean, that's my job. I call it my moonlighting job as a policymaker. I was on this board, starting 2007. I went on that board. Most of the members are politicians or other kinds of non-expert roles. And I went on that board. I've been studying air pollution and vehicles forever. I thought this is going to be a piece of cake. I know 90% of what I have to do. I probably knew maybe 20% of what I needed to know. We don't appreciate how difficult these questions are and how complicated. You get into the equity issues, you get into legal issues, you get into world, WTO issues. We should have a little more appreciation for our politicians.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dan. So now you invite Professor John Paul to give a short remark. Press, John.
Sure. Thank you, Jinhua, and thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. I've admired and relied on your work for many years. And so I have an observation I'll turn into a question, and then a question that I think picks up on something you were going to talk about in the latter slides, but didn't have time for. I very much like the frame of this change being socially determined, not technologically determined. And my question observation is on, the mandates and the policy things that are happening, not just in the US, but around the world. I think we can anticipate, some movement in a positive direction, convergence towards diffusion, but also some things that go the other way. So my question is, since the auto companies are global and plan their product portfolio on a global basis and aim for at least minimum efficient scale or higher, how much do the forces for acceleration in some places, like the EU standards and whatever's happening in California, tip the OEM's decision-making towards larger EV commitments? Or do you think that they'll hedge every time there's a sort of a step backwards in policy in some US state or at the US federal level to just delay or hold back investment? That's the first. I'll let you answer that. The second one's about plug-in hybrids if we have time.
Okay, so just like I say, we should have more appreciation for how difficult the politician's job is. These senior executives have a tremendously difficult challenge because they make their money from their combustion engine vehicles, and they're losing money, except for Tesla and maybe some of the Chinese companies. They're losing money on these EVs for now. And so how do you plan going forward? You have the US company, GM and Ford are much more focused on the US market, are greatly focused on the US market. So that's really influencing a lot of them. But you have companies like VW where something like 40% of their revenue comes from China. And so you can bet China, VW and BMW for that matter, and Mercedes are very attentive to the Chinese market as well as the European market. So I think, that's part of what they're doing. They're balancing it in those markets. The US companies are, I mean, GM is making these great pronouncements, but if you look at actual sales, it's really low, really small. But they're all hedging their bets. Then you have Toyota is an interesting case, because Toyota is actually one of the most conservative companies. I mean, just as a generalization, but with respect to these new technologies, and they made this play on hybrid vehicles 15 or 25 years ago, and they're trying to play that as long as they can. So they want hybrid vehicles, they want plug-in hybrids, they want to perpetuate those as long as they can. They've been very reluctant to get into the battery EVs. They have made a play with fuel cells, but they're being tentative on that. So, it's really every company, depending on where their focus of their market is, what their strength is. You have Stellantis also struggling, figuring out what to do, Chrysler. So fascinating.
Thanks. Given the time, I'll give the time to John Monzati for the audience question. Yeah, thanks.
Sure, go ahead.
Dan, the chat exploded, not only with really great questions, but also really great comments. So we're going to be sure to get this over to you so you can have a look after. But I'm going to start with a question from Robin Chase, who you inevitably know, the co-founder of Zipcar and transportation expert. So Robin's question is, when you talk about, right at the very beginning, when you talk about electric vehicles as the most important decarbonization strategy for transportation, she asked, I hope you're talking about electrification of vehicles of all kinds, including small ones like bikes, not just personal vehicles, which will never be a global transportation solution. And just before you get to the answer, just as sort of addendum here, it seems like in many ways, when we talk about decarbonization of transportation, there's these two camps. One camp says we need to electrify cars and trucks, and the other camp says, actually, cars and trucks are the problem. We need mode shift. We need to get people, an electric vehicle is still taking up space, crowding our cities, et cetera. And, a GM electric Hummer is not a very environmentally friendly vehicle. So I'm just curious how you address this bundle of questions.
Yeah, so I was mostly tailoring my comments to the US. While, electrification is still the most important, even in the developing countries eventually. But once you get out of the US, then I'll call it VMT reduction, or flattening VMT growth is really crucial, both for climate and for so many other reasons. I've been fighting the battle for VMT reduction. We actually have a law in California to do it. It's been a failure. It has not accomplished hardly anything of what it was intended to do. But in other countries, in other regions, it has to be a much higher priority. I'm working in India and China, Mexico, all those places. I will say this is something I'm swimming upstream on. Most of the rest of them, I was swimming downstream. This one is upstream, and that is our vehicles have gotten so big in the US, and we're I really fear we're perpetuating it with the way we're doing with electric vehicles. There's this range war, meaning you got to have 400-mile range, you got to have these massive batteries. We talk about a critical materials problem. I mean, we could just make our vehicles be 200 miles, and we've almost solved the problem right there. But that's where the policy mechanism, I'm going back to California and try to figure out how can we change some of these policy incentives so that they don't facilitate or even encourage larger size batteries and long range. At the federal level, it's probably even more challenging how to do that. We have footprint standards, we have light trucks get special, easier, less stringent standards. So that's okay. So I think I pulled together all the strings there.
Yeah, no doubt. It seems like we do need some policy around right sizing of our vehicles, certainly in this country. There's a cluster of questions. I'm just going to ask the question in one word: hydrogen.
Well, I wrote a book on hydrogen many years ago. My wife actually has been head of the California Fuel Cell Partnership. So I've been immersed in that world. California is leading, my colleague Lou Fulton is helping lead one of the hydrogen hubs. So I've been deeply immersed in that. But, end of the day, okay, here's a simple way of putting it, is that we're going to make hydrogen with electricity, with electrolyzers. That's how renewable hydrogen will be mostly made. And so obviously the most efficient and cost-effective use of that electricity is in a battery electric vehicle. And everything else is going to be more expensive and less efficient. But the reality is that we don't have a uniform market, uniform consumers, uniform circumstances. And so, at least in the transportation sector, there's going to be many places where I think hydrogen will play a role. Like that last 30% of the market, hydrogen might actually be, the right thing for many of those people. And for the big Class 8, over the road tractor trailers, hydrogen might turn out to be the best choice there, despite what Elon Musk says.
Good.
Great. Yeah, sorry to cut in here. The time flies by very quickly. Right.
We could keep going here.
Yeah, some of the questions John could continue on this, but given time, so thank you so much again, Dan, and everybody who joined me. Thank Professor Sperling for the brilliant presentation and conversation on that. It's really.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.